This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But, most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 75 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the serial Mormon history podcast. Today is Thursday, November 2nd, 2017. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. On this episode, the era of excitement for the new official Mormon home in Nauvoo gets to the leadership's collective head. Jack Bennett gets up on the stand during his mayoral inauguration and sets out a number of decrees Nauvoo would need to fulfill if it's to last into the coming decade. The Nauvoo government establishes a small number of committees and passes ordinances to set out the letter of the theocratic law. Nauvoo would be a temperate society, but effectively fostered an underground market for liquor, just like the U.S. government in the following century. But Jo and Bennett had their fingers on the knobs for who could buy and sell liquor within the city limits. This episode is all about organization by a group which had suffered from lack thereof for over a decade up to this point. After that, we're joined by Jack Naneek of the Mormon Awakenings podcast to discuss just what it means to be a member of the church and seek validation from our Mormon community. Let's get into it. All right, let's round things up a little bit with a little milk from last episode to tease our palate. Last episode, we read through most of Doctrine and Covenants section 124, as it was the first major revelation Jo gave in Nauvoo. Jo had hit the reset button, and he had to weld together the patchwork of church hierarchy that had been in place up to this point for the purposes of finally creating a stable system upon which the Mormons could finally rely. Nauvoo held its first official election with John Bennett being elected as mayor, with a number of trusted church elite elected to all other important offices. Jo had finally established his own Mormon theocracy. We discussed a number of land and business speculations infecting the Mormon elite, and we even discussed a story where Pistol Pack and Porter Rockwell had to attack a man to keep him from shooting Joseph Smith with a pistol. My apologies to anyone who may have died during our drinking game last episode. Things are just beginning to ramp up in Nauvoo. Let's hear what kind of crazy bucket of nonsense Jo and friends get stuck in today, with a little bit of meat.
As the scriptures say, they must have milk before meat.
Before jumping into the timeline, we talked about Robert D. Foster needing his very own Nemo nickname moving forward through our timeline. Foster said he would be blessed of God to rid the world of the tyrant that was Joseph Smith, after which Jo fined Robert Foster and his brother $100 for disorderly conduct. Our winner for Robert Foster's Nemo nickname submitted the winning entry because Jo commanded Robert Foster to build him a house. Thank you to @KB9WVI on Twitter for their entry, and we will now know Robert D. Foster as Bob the Builder. Of course, it's so simple. Bob the Builder, he built a house for Joseph Smith. Bob the Builder is now Robert D. Foster in our historical timeline. So, well done @KB9WVI, and head on over to Twitter and give them a follow if that tickles your fancy. So let's get into the historical timeline and talk about Nauvoo, because that is the focus of the podcast for the next, 9 years. Nauvoo is the central piece where Mormonism was hinging at this point, and it was finally time to get down to brass tacks. With the city being official and all but one of the elected city offices being filled by Mormons, suddenly everything Jo and his elite did in their meetings had real-life impact on government affairs, instead of just being passed as vacuous platitudes as had been done so frequently in the past. Beginning in mid-January 1841 and continuing all through March, the Mormons kicked into hyperdrive mode, and they got some real work done. Well, they put real work on paper in hopes that it would translate to reality. So let's get into what this actually means here. We read a couple of proclamations decreed by the Nauvoo government last episode, but now that the actual government was finally organized, it was time for people's own motivations to exert their corrupting influence on the Mormon populace. On February 3rd, 1841, John C. Wreck-It Bennett stood in front of the Nauvoo City Council and gave a speech detailing the future actions of the Mormons on social issues he thought most concerning at the time. This is from Dan Vogel's History of the Church, Volume 4, page 281. Before reading it, it should be noted that this entire speech that Wreck-It Bennett gave was actually removed from the History of the Church when it was initially compiled into books C1 and C2 of the documentary History of the Church, but it was published in the Times and Seasons, so it is included in Vogel's version of the History of the Church. From John Bennett's mayoral inauguration address, quote, "Gentlemen of the City Council, aldermen and councilors, having been elected to the mayoralty of this city by the unanimous suffrage of all parties and interests, I now enter upon the duties devolving upon me as your chief magistrate under a deep sense of the responsibilities of this station. I trust that the confidence reposed in me by my fellow citizens has not been misplaced, and for the honor conferred they will accept my warmest sentiments of gratitude. By the munificence and wise legislation of noble, high-minded, and patriotic statesmen, and the grace of God, we have been blessed with one of the most liberal corporate acts ever granted by a legislative assembly." And then he goes on to say that from time to time he'll communicate his concerns as mayor to the other city council officials, and he's taking an opportunity to do so right now in his inaugural address. Quote, "The 21st section of the addenda to the 13th section of the city charter concedes to you plenary power, quote, to tax, restrain, prohibit, and suppress tippling houses, dram shops, etc., etc., end quote. And I now recommend, in the strongest possible terms, that you take prompt, strong, and decisive measures to prohibit and suppress all such establishments. It is true you have the power to tax or license and tolerate them and thus add to the city finances, but I consider it much better to raise revenue by an ad valorem tax on the property of sober men than by licensing dram shops or taxing the signs of the inebriated worshippers at the shrine of Bacchus. The revel of the Bacchanalians in the house of blasphemy and noise will always prove a disgrace to a moral people." He's really letting out his entire rants against alcohol here. "Public sentiment will do much to suppress the vice of intemperance and its concomitant evil results, but ample experience has incontrovertibly proven that it cannot do all. The law must be brought to the rescue and an effective prohibitory ordinance enacted. This cannot be done at a better time than at present. It would be difficult to calculate the vast amount of evil and crime that would be prevented, and the great good that would accrue to the public at large by fostering the cause of temperance. But suffice it to say that the one would be commensurate to the other. No sales of spirituous liquors whatever in less quantity than a quart, except in cases of sickness on the recommendation of a physician or surgeon duly accredited by the chancellor and regents of the university, should be tolerated. The liberty of selling the intoxicating cup is a false liberty. It enslaves, degrades, destroys, and wretchedness and want are attendant on every step. Its touch, like that of the poison upas, is death. Liberty to do good should be cheerfully and freely accorded to every man, but liberty to do evil, which is licentious, should be peremptorily prohibited." End quote. Wreck-It Bennett was what was known as a teetotaler, but his teetotalitarianism didn't limit itself to him just staring down his nose at somebody who had a drink. He was actually a temperance advocate. Bennett hated it when people were drunk. Bennett had his vices, But that didn't stop him from trying to outlaw other people's vices. His vice was illegal. Adultery laws had just been passed by the Illinois state legislature less than 10 years prior to this time in Nauvoo. So if Bennett couldn't be happy legally, then nobody could, right? We saw how prohibition went in this country, but we have the luxury of looking back at the 1920s and the following Great Depression to see the widespread impact of the successful, in scare quotes, temperance movement. Bennett was working with an insufficient data set in forwarding the temperance agenda in Nauvoo because the prohibition era hadn't happened yet for him. So what's interesting is this temperance movement in Nauvoo kind of flew in the face of the prophet. Jo had been an early drunkard from a very young age. He was likely making whiskey with his dad in the barn to sell over the winter time, and he took almost no efforts to conceal his own frequent botulism, even supplying the Mormons with barrels of wine during celebrations like the Kirtland Temple dedication ceremony, and even requiring wine to be used in the sacrament ceremony until late 1830. And even in the Word of Wisdom, that was written only 7 years prior to this, it makes allowances for beer and wine of your own make. Jo liked alcohol. But I think this may be a time in Mormon history where Jo was forced to cede some authority to somebody else with a long-term goal in mind. Bennett had done what was necessary to get the Nauvoo Charter passed through the Illinois legislature, and he had devoted hours of his valuable time as an elected official of Illinois to Jo and the Mormons. So it was kind of fair that Jo paid him back as a sign of goodwill by allowing temperance to move forward through Nauvoo. So Reckitt Bennett making Nauvoo a dry city, it was, in my mind, Jo exhibiting to Bennett that he was willing to give ground and compromise with Bennett, even if Jo may have a fundamental disagreement with Bennett's certain decrees. If we read Bennett's decree and Jo's following actions through that lens, I think it paints a more holistic picture of the scenario, because a mere 2 weeks later, Bennett's prohibition ordinance passed with Jo giving a qualifier to assuage any personal concerns which may arise. This is from the Vogel History of the Church, Volume 4, page 293, about 10 pages later. Quote, Section 1, be it ordained by the City Council of the City of Nauvoo that all persons and establishments whatever in this city are prohibited from vending whiskey in a less quantity than a gallon, or other spirituous liquors in less quantity than a quart to any person whatever, excepting on the recommendation of a physician duly accredited in writing by the Chancellor and Regents of the University of the City of Nauvoo, and any person guilty of any act contrary to the prohibition contained in this ordinance shall, on conviction thereof before the mayor or municipal court, be fined in any sum not exceeding $25 at the discretion of said mayor or court. And any person or persons who shall attempt to evade this ordinance by giving away liquor or by any other means shall be considered alike amenable and fined as aforesaid. Passed February 15th, 1841. End quote. So that was passed. And you can see the similarities or the exact copy and paste from Bennett's decree in, early February to this actual ordinance that Joseph proposed and passed on February 15th. And it was passed. You can imagine that the various members of the council who preferred their drink weren't too pleased about this, and there were a number of them. So I assume this declaration was met with a bit of ire. But Jo was happy to explain the matter away in some kind of effort to allay frustrations by saying this, quote, in the discussion of the foregoing bill, I spoke at great length on the use of liquors and showed that it was unnecessary and operates as a poison in the stomach, and that roots and herbs can be found to effect all necessary purposes, end quote. Just a side note, recently posted up in the Joseph Smith Entheogen Facebook group, which if you would like to join that, send me a message on Facebook and I'll get you added to it. There was a recent post in there about cannabis wine that's now being sold in states that cannabis is legal. So yeah, roots and herbs can be infused into wine or into oil or into water, even boiled into water, whatever the case is, and their psychoactive chemicals can be distilled and delivered that way instead of through alcohol. So anyway, I've actually read that exact quote on this podcast before, and that's when Cody and I were talking about the Smith-Entheogen theory. But this offers the historical context surrounding the quote, and February 1841 is when this was given and decreed. So let's examine that quote in context with the entirety of the Prohibition Bill and Reckitt Bennett's War on Drinks. First off, Bennett's decree from the pulpit and the wording in Joe's actual temperance ordinance strike an interesting few details into the law. It only forbids the sale of whiskey and liquor and wraps in anybody who just conveniently gives some alcohol or gifts it or, gives it away. Giving away liquor. So if people try and just give it away in that way, they're all in violation. Anybody transferring alcohol is basically in violation. But it says nothing about the production of alcohol for sale in other places. It only forbids the sale and transfer of alcohol within the city limits. And it also adds the limiters to the amount of alcohol that can be sold by saying no whiskey under a gallon or other spirituous liquors less than a quart can be sold. But it says nothing about growlers or barrels. So this means that alcohol could legally be bought and sold in large quantities, so they were really only outlawing the sale of alcohol in the quantities that are sold in bars by the glass. There's also the doctor note provision written in there, so you could buy and consume alcohol if your doctor gives you a note. Just look how well that works in medicinal cannabis states where they eventually become recreationally legal cannabis states. So given everything that happened with this temperance bill, it should be considered that alcohol was one way to be hydrated in the 19th century. I know that seems crazy to us, right? But when clean water was a precious commodity, you tended to add a little bit of alcohol to water and it kills a bunch of disease-inducing bacteria that commonly lives in water. And it makes tainted water taste not so terrible. Or you can just drink beer or some version of liquid alcohol and you get some level of hydration, even in the long run if it's dehydrating you. But people died from alcohol poisoning all the time back then. But people were often faced with a decision of drinking stream water that may very well be carrying cholera or drinking alcohol that may cause slight inebriation, but it won't carry cholera. This was Reckitt Bennett's take. He wanted nobody to drink alcohol in town. Bennett didn't even have the Increase Mather perspective. That was a guy. Increase Mather said in the early 1700s, quote, "Drink is in itself a good creature of God and to be received with thankfulness. But the abuse of drink is from Satan and wine is from God, but the drunkard is from the devil." End quote. So at least Increase Mather's perspective is moderate, allowing for drinking, but saying that abuse of alcohol is from the devil. But that's not what Bennett was going for. He wasn't taking a soft line here. So when you outlaw the sales of spirituous liquor in an area, that has some interesting economic impacts. So let's examine that. And this is specifically just alcohol sales in small quantities. What this did, it forced Mormons to go outside of Nauvoo when they inevitably needed to satiate their thirst, which meant that they were driving money out of the city, or they were pushing it underground, making the city unable to collect taxes from the sales of this alcohol. The way this played itself out was grog shops and bars outside of Nauvoo were the only place where people could get their alcohol. And they did. I mean, Mormons drank. They're not like the temple attending, straight-laced Mormons or straight-edge, I guess you could say, Mormons that live in Utah now. These people drank alcohol a lot. So Thomas Sharp, we have to talk a little bit about Thomas Sharp. Thomas Sharp wrote articles about the Mormons, and they are published in the Warsaw Signal newspaper. And his articles offer some wonderful insights to the actual day-to-day practices of the Mormons. So he wrote in his 14th July 1841 article titled "Temperance Among the Mormons" about how the Mormons took care of their thirst. And I'm reading this from Lamar Peterson's Hearts Made Glad. This is starting on page 192. Quote, "People at a distance are apt to imagine the Mormons a very temperate body of men, because the ordinances of their city forbid the sale of ardent spirits, unless under very severe restrictions. But this impression is false. It is true that the saints do not get drunk at home, but they have only to cross the river to Montrose, and there they can revel to their heart's content in spiritual luxuries. Even the prophet himself, although a seeming devotee of the temperance cause, is a better friend to Bacchus than to any other god, except perhaps Plutus." Now, Plutus is the Greek god for wealth. We have heard of 3 sprees of his in the last 10 months. Sprees, he's talking about alcoholic benders. In the first, he appeared amongst his followers and offered to prove the truth of his mission by miracle, which was to climb a hickory pole 60 feet high with the bark off, heels upward. I'm a prophet because I can climb a really tall tree. I mean, it's amazing. The second was on board the steamer Nauvoo in her excursion to Bloomington last fall. On this occasion, His Holiness, Joseph, drank whiskey until he found himself on his back, feeling upwards for the ground, so says our informant. Just completely passed out drunk. So says our informant. The third was last week. On this occasion, it does not appear that Joe was exactly drunk, but it seems strange to see the prophet of the Lord at the head of a champagne party, crying lustily, quote, "Take away the empty bottles and bring on the full ones. Verily, our modern prophet is the very beau ideal of a pious Christian. How abstemious, how self-denying. But this is none of our business. We will not turn preacher, however much the occasion may require." I mean, yeah, Thomas Sharp really didn't like the Mormons, and he's making these direct accusations from witness statements claiming that Joseph was very frequently, well, at least he said that they knew of 3 times in the last 10 months where he had gone on these wild benders. So maybe not very frequently, but I mean, he wasn't the pious prophet that, abstained from alcohol as Mormons typically paint for us today. So this is continuing from later on in Hearts Made Glad, and it's talking about the next week's periodical from Thomas Sharp in the Warsaw Signal. Quote, on July 21st, this 1841 still, Sharp noted the visit of Joseph Smith to Warsaw, accompanied by General John C. Bennett, and reported that inside their coach was a bowie knife, a rifle, pistols, ammunition, and a courage razor in the shape of a decanter. Courage razor, like a liquid courage, as we call it today. Whether wine, brandy, or gin, this deponent saith not. Half a mile from town, the prophet and suit halted and took a regular swig, doubtless by way of inspiration. On October 6th, the editor noted the establishment of a grog shop near the temple, the Nauvoo temple, and in an editorial on December 8th, this is still 1841, entitled Mormon Military Operations, reported destruction of the grog shop by the Nauvoo Legion, armed with swords, spears, muskets, pistols, and banners. Now quoting from the actual article, this most courageous action of the Nauvoo Legion will undoubtedly entitle it to a high place on the tablet of fame, more especially when it is remembered that this was their first battle, and their enemy was a grog shop, 8 feet long by 10 feet wide, end quote. That means, according to Thomas Sharp, the first fight encountered by the Nauvoo Legion was destroying a local bar, or grog shop as they call it. So, I mean, really, the Mormon leadership was militant about liquor in and around Nauvoo. And this is from later on in Lamar Peterson's book. Quote, a few days before the destruction of Kilbourne's shop, that Kilbourne ran a groggery, Joseph recorded the fate of the groggery kept by a stonemason and a merchant who had worked on both the Kirtland and Nauvoo temples. This is from Joseph's journal, quote, in obedience to an order from the Mayor Bennett, I called out 2 companies of the Nauvoo Legion and removed a grog shop kept by Pulaski S. Cahoon, which had been declared a nuisance by the city council, end quote. So a grog shop, which was declared a nuisance by the powers that be, was destroyed at the hands of Jo and the Nauvoo Legion. Let's investigate the provision written into Bennett's declaration. He said no sales of spirituous liquors whatsoever in a less quantity than a quart, except in the cases of sickness, recommendation, so on and so forth, should be tolerated. Jo wrote that prohibition ordinance as duly accredited in writing by the Chancellor and Regents of the University of Nauvoo. So for the record, Mayor Bennett was declared as Chancellor of the University of Nauvoo. So John Reckitt Bennett had the final say in who would be able to get a license to sell liquor. Do you think that anybody on Reckitt Bennett or Joe's shit list had their application approved to sell liquor? A saint named Theodore Turley in 1843 built a saloon in Nauvoo, and he was permitted to keep it running by Joe, who was at that time mayor of Nauvoo after Bennett's volcanic exile. This is taken from quite a bit later in Hearts Made Glad. Quote, After Theodore Turley's success, as other breweries and taverns began to proliferate in the environs of the Saints, in Nauvoo, Ramis, Lima, Warren, Rushville, Zarahemla, which Zarahemla was what Montrose was named as, Joseph endeavored to keep a watchful eye on their operations. Record, now quoting from Joseph, "I have been ferreting out grog shops, groceries, and beer barrels. I have warned the rum and beer dealers to be scarce after this time, and the peace officers to watch the grog shops and give me seasonable notice of any disorder. If they are conducted as they have been, I will rip them up." But to ensure that the public would not be deprived of the high benefits of worthy brews and distillates, at Schulzler's, Turley's, Davis's, Law's, Hannah's, Lyons, Stevenson's, or Moser's, the prophet again revamped the ordinance for the advantage of the discreet. So all of those people were trusted Mormons who had the approval of the University of the City of Nauvoo, or the chancellors and the regents of the University of Nauvoo, to sell and distribute liquor and alcohol. So all of those people had grog shops, or they sold stuff under the table, basically. So this is how Joseph revamped the Nauvoo temperance ordinance. Quote, "Be it ordained by the city council of the city of Nauvoo that the mayor of this city is hereby authorized to sell liquors in such quantities as he may deem expedient." So at least Joseph himself is able to sell liquor. You know, people can't unless they get his approval, or he himself can, just because he wears the badge of mayor. "Be it further ordained that other persons not exceeding 1 to each ward of the city may also sell said liquors in like quantities for medicinal and mechanical purposes by obtaining a license of the mayor of the city." There you go. The above ordinance to be in full force and effect immediately after its passage, all ordinances to the contrary notwithstanding. That was passed January 16th, 1844, signed by Joseph Smith Mayor, end quote. People, regardless of belief, by and large, are going to get their alcohol. Okay, Joe knew it, Bennett knew it, all of the Mormons knew it, and the Mormons weren't straight edge about the word of wisdom back then like they are today. So Bennett had caused all legal sales of alcohol not approved of by the mayor to be illegal, which meant that there were only a few places that you could legally buy alcohol in Mormonville. And I'd be willing to bet that those who were granted licenses by Jo and Bennett were probably only those closest to Jo and company. So if we zoom out far enough and look at all of this outlaw of liquor, except for the people that Jo and Bennett approve of, all of these factors created a black market of alcohol sales at the small serving level, because sale of alcohol in bulk wasn't against the law or this Nauvoo ordinance, making it so those buying and selling liquor at a single consumer level would still have that money exchanged in the local Nauvoo economy, but the government couldn't tax it. The money was still, changing hands for people to buy just a single drink or two, but the Nauvoo government wasn't able to track any of those sales, nor tax it. So the Nauvoo government, as well as the federal government, weren't able to collect taxes on alcohol sales. And that's money that they could use in the Nauvoo economy. But if they're exporting that money in the form of taxes to the federal government, that's money that would be taken out of the Nauvoo economy. So it's reasonable that the Nauvoo government would want to retain that money from those microtransactions for the lowliest poor Mormons and keep that money inside the town. So they created this black market system with Jo and Bennett controlling the knobs by granting licenses to who they wanted to actually be able to sell liquor, and literally destroying any establishments which conflicted with the law. Joseph used the Nauvoo Legion to perform the destruction of these grog shops. I mean, it kind of like Carrier Nation, running in there with a hatchet and whatnot. Nauvoo was so corrupt, right? I mean, Nauvoo in 1840 was like Vegas in 1931, with all of these small interlocking regulations and social pressures, creating the perfect environment to gestate a viciously corrupt and self-serving elite ruling over the city. We're going to be discussing temperance and the murky waters of Nauvoo alcohol laws in future episodes, but this is a good primer. This is what created temperance in Nauvoo and created all of these weird alcohol laws in and around Nauvoo and essentially effectively created this black market. And what actually got us started down this rabbit hole of alcohol laws was Bennett's first official speech as mayor of Nauvoo. And we only got 1.5 paragraphs in, so let's read a little bit further into his discussion, or his inaugural address, and read a few of the highlights. And this is once again extracted from the History of the Church Dan Vogel edition, volume 4. Quote, "The immediate organization of the university, as contemplated in the 24th section of the Act incorporating our city, cannot be too forcibly impressed upon you at this time, as all matters in relation to mental culture and public instruction from common schools up to the highest branches of a full collegiate course in the arts, sciences, and learned professions will devolve upon the chancellor and regents of the university. They should be speedily elected and instructed to perform their plan and enter upon its execution with as little delay as possible. The wheels of education should never be clogged or retrograde, but roll progressively from the alpha to the omega of a most perfect, liberal, and thorough course of university attainments." End quote. So after that quote there, Bennett goes on to quote at length a passage from what he calls Alexander's Messenger. I wasn't sure what that was, so I had to do some digging, and I found this paper called Alexander's Weekly Messenger, and that was published during the time that Bennett lifted the paragraphs, and it was published in Pittsburgh. But I couldn't find an actual digital copy of this paper with the exact words, so basically the excerpt that Bennett recounted in his inaugural address just tells about the problems of people learning stuffs because it makes you stupid sounding with all of those really big words, and such is the quackery of education. And Reckitt Bennett concluded his thoughts about the lacking education system with a vacuous screed about how great the Nauvoo University education system would be. This is how Bennett ties it all up. Quote, "Our university should be a utilitarian institution, and competent, industrious teachers and professors should be immediately elected for the several departments. Knowledge is power. Foster education, and we are forever free. Nothing can be done which is more certainly calculated to perpetuate the free institutions of our common country, for which our progenitors fought and bled and died, than the general diffusion of useful knowledge among the people. Yeah, America! We fought and bled and died for our rights to get an education. The most liberal policy should attend the organization of the university, and equal honors and privileges should be extended to all classes of the community." End quote. So those platitudes are pretty much the point of all education systems, right? I mean, knowledge is power. Foster education will be free. I mean, these were vacuous. There wasn't any actual definition to this. But what do you expect from a politician who was just elected? So it took Jo and Reckitt Bennett just a few days to come up with the ordinances to organize the University of Nauvoo. And that was passed on the 9th of February, 1841. And I'm just going to read a little bit from it. Section 1, quote, "Be it ordained by the Council of the City of Nauvoo that the University of the City of Nauvoo be, and the same is, hereby organized by the appointment of the following Board of Trustees, to wit, John C. Bennett, Chancellor, William Law, Registrar, and Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, Hiram Smith, William Marks, Samuel H. Smith, Daniel Wells, Newell K. Whitney, Charles Rich, John T. Barnett, Wilson Law, Don Carlos Smith, John P. Green, Vincent Knight, Isaac Galland, Elias Higbee, Robert D. Foster, Bob the Builder, James Adams, Robert B. Thompson, Samuel Bennett, Ebenezer Robinson, John Snyder, George Miller, and Linus M. Knight, regents of the University of the City of Nauvoo." End quote. So, okay, that was necessary to read those names for something we'll be discussing here in just a couple of minutes. But those were all of the people that were elected to chair the University of the City of Nauvoo. Did any of those names sound familiar? I mean, whatever, we'll get into it. But it should be noted that this was just one more iteration of these various educational institutions that Joseph Smith was affiliated with. I mean, he started with the family on the Isaac Morley farm, that there was a small group of people that would meet and study the Bible and whatnot. Then it evolved into the School of the Prophets and the School of the Elders and the University of Missouri and these various institutions that they founded or attempted to create and were disbanded soon after they were created. So the University of the City of Nauvoo was just the next iteration of Joseph creating his own propaganda school, basically. So moving on through Bennett's address, included near the end of it was a little bit about his excitement for a new construction project. And this is what he says about this construction project. Quote, I would earnestly recommend the construction of a wing dam in the Mississippi at the mouth of the ravine at or near the head of Main Street, and the excavation of a ship canal from that point to a point terminating in a grand reservoir on the bank of said river, east of the foot of said street at a distance about 2 miles. This would afford at the various outlets the most ample water power for propelling any amount of machinery for mill and manufacturing purposes, so essentially necessary to the building up of a great commercial city in the heart of one of the most productive and delightful countries on earth. I would advise that an agent be immediately appointed on behalf of the city corporation to negotiate with Eastern capitalists for the completion of this great work, on the most advantageous terms, make it a great deal, even to the conveyance of the privilege for a term of years. This work finished and the future greatness of this city is placed upon an imperishable basis. End quote. But he wasn't done, Bennett wasn't done decreeing the need for major projects. Continuing from later on, quote, the public health requires that the lowlands bordering on the Mississippi should be immediately drained and the entire timber removed. This can and will be one of the most healthful cities in the West, provided you take prompt and decisive actions in the premises, end quote. Now we're going to read one more of Bennett's proclamations included in this presentation, but I have to read from what comes up 2 days later in the history of the church. Remember, the history of the church was compiled from hundreds of sources, and it was all changed to be written from the first-person perspective of Joseph Smith. So read I as Joseph Smith in this. Quote, and I, meaning Joseph Smith, gave a general invitation to my friends to enroll themselves as to have a perfect organization by the 4th of July. He's talking about the organization of the Nauvoo Legion there. And it continues on. I was appointed chairman of several committees. Read on the canal, for vacating the town of commerce, vending spirituous liquors, code of city ordinances, board of health, etc. Council adjourned to the 8th. End quote. Let me get this straight. Joseph Smith was the chairman over all of these things? I mean, the canal committee for vacating the town of commerce, which meant subsuming or absorbing the town of commerce into Nauvoo. For vending spirituous liquors, Joe's going to be the director of that. Code of city ordinances, Joe's going to handle all of that. The board of health, they're going to handle that. And I assume that the board of health was tasked with draining the swamp. And that's not the Trumpian draining the swamp. That's literally draining the swamplands around Nauvoo. Joe's going to handle all this. He's chairman over all these things. Yeah, you'll have to pardon me for having a lack of faith in his ability to execute things, but Joe doesn't strike me as the kind of guy who can actually get things done. You know, Marie and I just read through Doctrine and Covenants section 105 for the My Book of Mormon podcast, which is the revelation that Joe gave at the end of Zion's camp, basically telling everybody that the 1,000-mile trip that they had all just done was for nothing and that it was time for them to go home. You're going to have to go listen to those episodes when they come out, and that'll be in a week or two. But basically, Joe couldn't follow the golden rule of under-promise and over-deliver when it came to everything that he did. Are we really to expect that Nauvoo was his leaf-turning moment? Here's another passage that really drives this point home. Quote, and the following persons were elected by the council to their offices, to wit, Henry G. Sherwood, Marshal, James Sloan, Recorder, Robert B. Thompson, Treasurer, James Robinson, Assessor, Austin Cowell, Supervisor of Streets, and then Joe just goes on to present a resolution thanking various government officials for being friends to the Mormons and passing all of this legislation. I just find it incredible. Joe is doing all of these things. He's expected to be doing all of these things while at the same time running a church as the prophet, seer, and revelator and the sole ecclesiastical authority. It's just fascinating. Well, we're going to talk about that in just a second here. The final point that Reckitt Bennett made in his inaugural screed was how awesome the Nauvoo Legion would be and how crucial the Nauvoo Legion would be in the Mormon survival. Quote, I would recommend the immediate organization of the Legion, comprising as it does the entire military power of our city, with a provision allowing any citizens of Hancock County to unite by voluntary enrollment. Early facilities should be afforded to the court-martial for perfecting their plans of drill, rules, and regulations. Nothing is more necessary to the preservation of order and the supremacy of the laws than the perfect organization of our military forces under a uniform and rigid discipline and approved judicious drill. And to this end, I desire to see all the departments and cohorts of the Legion put in immediate requisition. The Legion should maintain the Constitution and the laws, and be ready at all times for the public defense. The winged warrior of the air perches upon the pole of American liberty, and the beast that has the temerity to ruffle her feathers should be made to feel the power of her talons." End quote. In response to Bennett issuing this profound decree, Jo brought forward a bill on the 4th of February, which officially created the Nauvoo Legion. And I'm going to spare you reading the whole thing because, big surprise, it just lists a bunch of names that we've already heard a number of times when it comes to the Nauvoo government. I will, however, read you a couple of interesting passages from the history of the church with proper date stamps. Quote, "Be it ordained by the City Council of the City of Nauvoo that the inhabitants of the City of Nauvoo and such citizens of Hancock County as may unite by voluntary enrollment be, and they are hereby organized into a body of independent military men to be called the Nauvoo Legion." This actually had an addition. It said, quote, "Any citizen of Hancock County may by voluntary enrollment attach himself to the Nauvoo Legion with all the privileges which appertain to the independent military body." End quote. This was passed on the 4th of February, 1841. And it is seerstone clear that the Nauvoo Legion was initially organized as a voluntary militia. Enrollment numbers must have been lacking, because on the 20th of February, 16 days after the Nauvoo Legion was officially declared as a voluntary militia, this resolution was passed. Quote, "That no person whatever residing within the city limits of the city of Nauvoo between the ages of 18 and 45 years, excepting such as are exempted by the laws of the United States, shall be exempted from military duty, unless exempted by a special act of this court. And the fines for neglecting or refusing to appear on the days of general parade were fixed at the following rates." End quote. And then it goes on to list a scale of fines for those who don't show up. So that means that 2 weeks after its creation, the Nauvoo Legion, that was initially created as a voluntary military force, became a mandatory enrollment militia with monetary penalties for those who don't attend. We may wonder how the Nauvoo Legion was able to garner 3,000 to 4,000 fighting men so quickly after its creation. Well, that's because there was a Mormon draft, without the pressing need of an active war to justify said draft. Just to be clear, though, the Nauvoo Legion didn't often run drills or practice shooting at range or anything. For the most part, it was comprised of farmers and city workers who were there to follow the prophet, dressed up in battle regalia with their rifles parading around town. The fact that they were a drafted army who spent more time battling against inanimate grog shops than they did against any actual army or mob didn't seem to make them any less intimidating to observers, though. It would be a mere 2 months later that this legion would be out in full force parading through the Nauvoo city streets during the Temple Cornerstone ceremony, which exhibited a sight to instill fear of the unknown potential of the Mormons in the hearts of any casual observer, like Thomas Sharp, who was the editor of the Warsaw Signal. So in the 20th of January 1841 publication of the Warsaw Signal, Thomas Sharp reprinted a few extracts which were first published in the Times and Seasons. You're going to find a link to the Warsaw Signal archives digitized by Dale Broadhurst, and that's hosted on sydneyrigdon.com. Let me read a quick extract from that 20th of January article. Quote, "The, scare quote, Nauvoo Legion embraces all our military power and will enable us to perform our military duty by ourselves and thus afford the power and privilege of avoiding one of the most fruitful sources of strife, oppression, and collision with the world. It will enable us to show our attachment to the state and nation as a people whenever the public service requires our aid, thus proving ourselves obedient to the paramount laws of the land and ready at all times to sustain and execute them." End quote. So at least the Mormons were willing to concede control of the Nauvoo Legion in any case that the Illinois government might need their services. But still, the Nauvoo Legion was created as a military force to protect the Mormons. There was really no other use or application for this. And because the Mormons never ended up coming against armed conflict and any large scale at any subsequent time, until after Joseph's death, the Nauvoo Legion were just there as an intimidation force. And Thomas Sharp, who edited the Warsaw Signal and published this, he was very intimidated by the fact that the Mormons were able to call together 3,000 to 4,000 fighting men. But it was a mandatory draft, so I don't know. Were those people really willing to fight and die for their brethren? Possibly. Were they really willing to go off to war for Joseph? I don't know. I don't know about that. I guess we'll never know. The Mormons were a bit rushed to cobble the Nauvoo Legion together. There was something that happened back in Missouri, which may help explain the hasty nature of the Legion's organization and the church government draft mandating all of the Mormon men from 18 to 45 to enlist. So what happened in Missouri at this same exact time, the Mormon situation in Missouri was just simmering at this time. The Mormons felt wronged, the Missourians felt wronged, nobody had a solid case for their side given the politics of Jackson's democracy and everything that had happened between the two parties. Nobody was on the up and up. The Missouri state government decided to finally copy and publicly release all of the documents that they'd collected related to the Missouri Mormon War of 1838. We read through a bunch of these on episode 50. Missouri had just made an announcement that they had procured 2,000 copies of all of these documents set to be distributed soon. How would that release of all of this previously private documentation affect the public perception of the Mormons? What would the typical citizen of Illinois think when they read about Dr. Sampson of Vard's testimony concerning the Danites and the Mormon depredations in Daviess County? Would that information release incite a mob out of Illinois, which would drive the Saints out once again and force them to find a new home? I mean, these are big questions, and it's just the release of this information that was spawning all of these. These unanswered questions must have led to Jo and Bennett's expediting the Nauvoo Legion formation as a preemptive response. Just in case an army does come up from Missouri or an army is raised in Illinois to chase the Mormons out, they have the mandatory Nauvoo Legion there to defend their land. To extend this conversation a little bit further and widen the scope a little bit, I want to comment on some of the names that we've read today in these various committee formations and ordinances and everything relating to the Nauvoo government that we've discussed today. Think of how many names appeared on these committees when they were formed, and I spared you reading a lot of them because it was redundant. Most of the people for the Nauvoo House Committee were the same people who were looking into the canal project, who were also attempting to build and run a university, who were also members of the Mormon elite running the church. Personally, I've articulated it ad nauseum where I see major issues with the church and state entanglement there, so I'm going to spare you that particular soapbox for today. Where I'm concerned is the simple lack of man hours here. I mean, yes, the Mormons in this early 1841 time seemed invigorated with the passing of the Nauvoo Charter, and they were translating that excitement into creating a bunch of new committees and organizations, which the city needed. Don't get me wrong. The city needed it if it was, something slated to survive for any amount of time. But there's only so thin that you can spread people when their day-to-day activities were likely occupied with taking care of their families and building homes on swampland and preparing to plant crops in the soon-to-be-thawed-out soil. I mean, these men were already busy with their government positions and all the church affairs they were dealing with as members of the different quorums, and now they're responsible for creating a university from the ground up and draining a swamp and building a canal. I mean, how exactly are all of these men going to handle this? I mean, we all bite off more than we can chew from time to time, right? But this is reaching a breaking point where none of these things are actually going to come to fruition that they embark upon. All of these projects are just going to fall flat. I mean, how many committees and tasks can you assign to one person before they become completely ineffective at doing any and all of them? Look, the Nauvoo government needed the infrastructure that the Mormons were building in the early months of 1841, and they needed a wide range of people with a diversity of skill types to make building Nauvoo a success. Instead, What we see is Jo and Reckitt Bennett double, triple, and quintuple dipping into the same well of trusted Mormon elite to do everything the town needed. And what's crazy about this, most of these people didn't even have expertise in what they were called to do. Jo was to be the surveyor for the canal project, among many other things. Did Jo have any mathematics or engineering under his belt? Had he ever dug a 2-mile-long canal through the middle of a town before? No, but he was the leading guy on these projects. And this same trend happens over and over the further Nauvoo gets into its early construction phase. This excitement and invigoration the Mormon leadership had would peter out pretty quickly. They were in this early formation stage, but like any big project somebody gets super excited about, as soon as Jo and the Mormons realized how grand the task they embarked upon truly was, they ran out of steam pretty quickly. And most of these projects never end up going anywhere and do nothing more than suck resources out of an already bankrupt system. And one more thing to add into the mix here, there are a number of times when Jo takes second in command, when we expect him to be the leader of the Mormons. Think about this. Back in Nauvoo, Oliver Cowdery was always taking the reins from Jo when handling small matters, as were the Whitmers. When in Kirtland and Missouri, Hinchpin Sidney Rigdon was almost always running the show and giving the best sermons. When Jo was in Liberty Jail and the Mormons were making their exodus to Illinois and Iowa, Bloody Brigham Young and Heber Creeper Kimball were calling all the shots. This same thing happened with Reckitt Bennett. Bennett gave this inaugural speech telling the Mormons about everything they needed to do, which obviously evolved out of conversations he was having with other members of the trusted elite and Joseph, but that's beside the point. That Reckitt Bennett was mayor, and Jo was usually overseeing what was being done and was usually the guy submitting the reports to the council and aldermen for the review. Jo wasn't in the dictatorial position when John Bennett was around. He seemed to be acting more as Bennett's assistant in these situations, carrying out whatever the doctor ordered. And maybe, just maybe, that's one reason why Bennett is so maligned and written out of church history beyond just his expose. Bennett was a powerful guy, and when he was around, Jo seemed to be overshadowed by Bennett's presence and superior ideas. Reckitt Bennett had a lot of experience with different religions. He had a small number of government positions throughout his time, and in many ways, Jo was inferior to Bennett's intellect and ideas. It was actually thanks to Bennett that polygamy became a proper teaching and doctrine in the Mormon Church. Bennett had the steel nerves to boldly do what Jo had only dreamed of doing. Now, in no way am I commending him for his actions. I think he was a terrible human being. However, I do find him fascinating nonetheless. Maybe it's time we give Reckitt Bennett his proper place in Mormon history. Or at least take notice of all that he contributed, good and bad, to the Mormons in his short 1.5-year stay with them. Really, if it weren't for John Bennett, Nauvoo probably never would have become a thing. They may never have had the organization skills necessary to do or begin to do what Bennett had dictated as mayor of Nauvoo. They may not have had the lobbying force that he was able to bring to the table to get the Nauvoo Charter passed. Instead of casting aspersions towards Bennett, maybe we should take some time to appreciate his time and effort in the church while still condemning his blatant misogyny and usury as the opportunist that he truly was. He and Jo were frighteningly compatible. Makes you really wonder, maybe there's an alternate universe out there, wherein Utah is peppered with statues of Bennett instead of Brigham. What you're about to listen to is part 1 of a conversation that I had with a man named Jack Naneek. I'll say at the onset, there were a few things he said which I wish that we both could have examined a little bit deeper, but all in all, I think this conversation was really interesting. Next week's episode will have part 2, and I'm going to include some of my closing thoughts about both parts at the end of that episode, so be sure to check out the Mormon Discussion podcast feed for the Mormon Awakenings podcast that Jack hosts. And I suppose I'll talk at you on the other side of the conversation. Joining me today is a fellow podcaster of a fellow Mormon Mormon discussion podcast, but of course, Mormon discussion is kind of a term that's appropriated for the actual Mormon discussion podcast. It's just a fellow Mormon podcast. This is Jack Naneek of the Mormon Awakenings podcast. How you doing, Jack?
Good. How are you today?
I'm quite well. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me.
I have a couple of questions. I recently listened to a few of your shows, and I had some questions for you.
Okay.
But I do want to let the listeners know exactly why I first started listening to your podcast and why I got interested. A listener told me that you made a quick reference to the Joseph Smith entheogen theory in one of your episodes.
I did.
And I'm always curious when people talk about it because I want to hear what they're saying about it. So lo and behold, I downloaded your most recent podcast from when we were recording this. I believe that was episode 21.
Yeah.
And there it was. You talked about it briefly.
I did. That was a great podcast, by the way, of yours, the entheogen. And I think I screwed it up. I think I said it was the active ingredient to ayahuasca, which I'm no active ingredient expert, but I think it's actually psilocybin, right?
So psilocybin is one of the main possible contenders. The active ingredient in ayahuasca is mescaline. If I'm not mistaken.
Is that the same as dimethyltryptamine?
Dimethyltryptamine is it's a distilled version, basically. So it's the thing is ayahuasca has so many recipes, and some ayahuasca makes dimethyltryptamine, whereas mescaline is usually the primary ingredient in DMT or in ayahuasca recipes, along with peyote cacti and Amanita muscaria. Mushrooms, they all have that shared active ingredient mescaline.
So I may have technically screwed that up. It's actually psilocybin, we think, is what Joseph Smith, at least according to your theory, right? That's what you guys were postulating.
It seems possible. There are a number of other contenders. There's ergot, which is also a fungus.
Ergot, I remember.
And that can be taken off of grain heads and made into a beer or into bread that's ergotized, and that can be quite psychoactive. And then, there are a number of things. Of course, I don't want to dive too deep into it, but I wanted to let the listeners know why initially I was turned on to your podcast and why I've been consuming it. But I have prepared a few questions based on last few episodes that you put up, but I want to preface this conversation by asking you to do something that you may not know how to do or you may not agree with doing, but I want to ask it of you anyway, if you're okay with it.
Put me on the spot. Is this gotcha podcasting?
That's right. For the purposes of this conversation, can you put yourself in a box or a label for the listeners, just so everybody can kind of understand where we're all coming from here?
In a box or a label? What type of box or what type of label regarding what?
You're not a typical chapel attending Mormon. You know Mormonism, you know Mormon history. You're well aware of the issues that are that exist in the church, but yet I still hear you talking about what you taught in elders quorum and talking about church as you seem to be a usual an active attender. So is there a box, like a New Order Mormon box or something that you fit in that we can use as a label for this conversation?
Well, that's a hard question. I'm not averse to answering that question. I just think it might be a hard question to answer. Okay. And I'll tell you why. I do attend. I'm a very regular attender. I enjoy it. I like the community. Having said all that, I view it more as a hospital, as a place to contribute, as a place to, serve, have friends, learn to love, receive love. I'm not as hung up on black and white, one true path Mormonism, or how do I say this? It's hard to describe. It's hard to put the label on, and so I'm not as hung up on the one true path and that sort of stuff. At the same time, I find a lot of mystical experiences there. I think there's a lot of spiritual experiences to be found there. There's a massive amount of truth and inspiration, and so maybe New Order Mormon applies, maybe Progressive Mormon. And the reason I resist those kind of labels is I just think over time, no label is going to fit or apply permanently. And you're not going to fit into any particular box permanently over time in anyone's life.
Right.
And so it's sort of, anything that I would call myself today, it's a snapshot anyways of the moment. And 5 years from now or 10 years from now. And I don't think we talk about those sort of evolutionary changes in life in general, but particularly inside the Mormon community, of how people's, just the way that we think, the way that we believe, the way that we practice spirituality, the way we commune with God, those things all evolve and change over time. And I think we don't talk about that sort of evolution inside our community, but I don't think we do that. I think people just don't do that in life. That's just something we don't talk about. So how's that for a, I don't know if that's a dodge or if that's just a recognition of the difficulties of putting a label on oneself or putting oneself in a box.
Well, and I understand where you're coming from. It's definitely a challenge, and anytime that I'm asked to put a label on myself, I'm usually at pains to do so, because there's not usually one label that describes me. There's one label that will somewhat aptly describe one aspect of me or of my personality or of my life, but by and large, there's so much more nuance that these labels don't seem to use very well. And I want to use that as a jumping off point to discuss something that you talked about in a recent episode of Mormon Awakenings. And I think this kind of wraps into the discussion. You talked about people, the kind of this line between first half of life people and second half of life people. And do you mind telling us a little bit about this concept, and where would you find yourself on this metric as opposed to the standard chapel attending TBM that the ex-Mormon subreddit labels people as?
Yeah, and I don't know if there is I don't know if there really is a chapel attending TBM category. I think there's people that maybe look like that on the surface. So I am resistant to categorizing folks in such stark terms, but setting that aside, I think I know what you're asking. I think so, and maybe my answer will let you know if I know what you're asking. But I like to think I'm a second half of life person. But who knows? But the idea is basically, there's a time in one's life when. And you could think about this specifically about learning a skill or learning anything, but there's a time in life where you're learning and you're acquiring knowledge and you're acquiring experience. And during that period, you really don't have judgment because you have no reference points. You have no understanding. But as you learn any particular skill or any body of knowledge, and as you live life, you start to acquire experience and sort of visceral understanding and kind of visceral judgment, and you get a sense more of what things mean. And as that happens, you transition from needing to be told really explicitly and in really black and white terms what is what, to someone who kind of knows just because they know through experience, mainly through experience. I don't know if there's any other way of saying it. And when you get to that point, then you can kind of, you just decide yourself quickly. And instructions and black and white rubrics and paradigms and all that sort of stuff make sense in a different way because you now see why people are explaining things the way they do, but maybe you would explain it that way or maybe you wouldn't, but you sort of understand things differently. And on a real specific, if you just think about the experience of learning what honey tastes like, for instance, I can explain to you, first half of life person, what honey tastes like and what it looks like and the sensation and the color and the viscosity, all that sort of stuff. And that'll help you for sure. And I can say, you ought to try it, you ought to taste it. And then one day you'll run across honey and you'll see something that looks like honey and it smells like honey and you'll taste it and then you'll really taste honey. And then you'll know, and then you'll understand all the descriptions, but they're different. And they're you understand why someone described honey the way that they did, but now that you've had your own experience, maybe you describe it differently. And, so that's kind of on a real micro level, that what I think happens to most people over time. And so it's hard to say categorically my first half or second half. I guess in parts of my life I'm more second half than first half, but maybe other parts I'm still first half.
Maybe I see this. It seems like first half versus second half. Once you cross this imaginary line into second half, it doesn't seem like first half has as much meaning to you. But I think that people can be, by this metric, they can be in first half in some aspects of their life and second half in other aspects.
Yes, I think that's right.
And I think what you're getting at here is kind of a very blurry dividing line between naive and wise, right? Because
and for sure there's no line. I think that's right. It is a spectrum,
Okay. And in that kind of similar vein, then, when it comes to deep Mormon history, I want to read a post that one of my friends posted in a blog.
Okay.
This was posted in my friend Tanner's blog, diligenceovertime.blogspot.pe. And this is what he said about Joseph Smith. And maybe we can this can kind of be a jumping off point to talk about church history.
Yep.
He wrote, quote, "I love the prophet. I love the honest 14-year-old who was too honest to pretend religious certainty and persisted until he gained that for himself. I love the brave, screaming child who refused whiskey when undergoing a brutal prairie surgery on his leg bone and was more worried about his mother's disposition than his own pain throughout the ordeal. I love the teenager who struggled to become worthy to retrieve the plates that were revealed to him by Moroni. I love the loving father, the dutiful husband. I love the family man, who resisted polygamy until an angel threatened him with a sword and then fulfilled his Abrahamic test in spite of his fidelity to Emma. I love the honest and brave thinker who exploded the notions of the Trinity, a closed canon, an immaterial ontology, and the cruelties of the middle-aged church. That prophet gave me Mormonism. That prophet taught me that the theological equivocations that pushed God nebulously back into unidentifiable, indistinct, impersonal nothingness were false. God is real. God is physical. Heaven is not ether. But these things are not true. That prophet is dead. He was not killed by the hateful bullets of a bigoted mob. He was killed by those who made him because he never existed. Every story told in correlated Mormonism, especially about Joseph Smith, is incomplete and often entirely false. I am not out of Mormonism because I hated Joseph Smith or the simple truths. I am out because I loved them so much." End quote. And thank you for writing it so eloquently, Tanner.
Yeah, and I think I saw that. That made its way around the internet.
It's a really powerful post, and the thing is it gets to so many deep frustrations that Mormons have when they start researching the real history of the church and come to find out that it is in many ways in stark contrast to the version of the church history that they will talk about in the correlated church doctrine classes. How is it, how does a person, I'll ask you this, Jack, and maybe we can talk about this on a theoretical sense, but how does a person know about the real Joseph Smith and reconcile that with the correlated Joseph Smith that they teach? How do you still believe in Joseph Smith as a prophet?
That's a good question. There is this version that we've propagated, and people have really struggled with that. Richard Bushman has dove into the topic quite in depthly. This idea of Joseph Smith, the real guy versus the stories that we tell. And it's not unlike, as an analogy, the stories you learn about George Washington or Abraham Lincoln when you're young, or Christopher Columbus for that matter, when you're young. When you're in elementary school, I don't know if they still tell this now, but when I was a kid, they told us, George Washington chopped down the cherry tree, and I cannot tell a lie. And then at some point in your life, you find out that that's totally fabricated, and you're mad, And so I think that's what happens when you learn that, Joseph Smith was not exactly as advertised.
But I see a false dichotomy in this sense, because George Washington and Abraham Lincoln were a founding father and an amazing president who, did amazing things to help our country progress past slavery. They were never prophets. They never claimed to be. They never delivered anything that they considered to be canon or divine revelation from on high. They never claimed to speak for God. They spoke as men, writing things about men for men, and that's men in the royal sense.
Well, I mean, you're right on that point. But as far as the stories that are propagated about those guys and the nobility that they represented and the American ideal and all these sort of things, those stories are told about them to illustrate bigger principles of Americana or national ethic or however you want to think about it. And and we've done that with Joseph Smith, is my point. I don't think Joseph Smith he didn't write the correlation, for example, the correlation version of his life. Now he may had he been able to, maybe he would have.
Well, I mean, it was initially published in the Times and Seasons in beginning in he started dictating it in 1839, and they started publishing it in 1842 in the Times and Seasons, and that's the history of the church, the 7 volumes that we have of Joseph Smith's life, and that is all the correlated history. Albeit, well documented and well backed up by letters and newspaper clippings that they include. But still, I mean, Joseph did tell his own story in a correlated manner that the church is trying to propagate as best as they can. And he did ignore the skeletons in his closet that caused people to take pause at his claims of him being a prophet.
Yeah. Okay. So that may be. I mean, do you want me to? I'm not sure where you want me to take this at this point.
Yeah, I guess I'm just curious, how does one reconcile the correlated Joseph Smith with the real Joseph Smith?
Well, when I hear correlated Joseph Smith, I think of the versions that you're told in Sunday school and the pictures that are provided in the primary handbooks and kind of a watered down, rewritten version. I'm not as familiar with, I've not read all 7 volumes of history of the church, and I'm not aware of, the editing that Joseph Smith did personally at the end of his life to present an image to the world. So when I think of the correlated Joseph Smith, I think of the stories that I was told as a boy in primary and the things that exist in our manuals today. And there's a lot of facts and stories that are propagated that are just not accurate. I wouldn't say, I think the Facebook or the paragraph that you read was, it said everything was inaccurate and it's all a lie. I mean, there are things that are accurate, but clearly it's more propaganda than it is historical fact. It's more, it has a purpose and it's more a story than it is history, I guess. And so I'm not as familiar with what Joseph Smith was saying about himself in 1841 or 1842. But let's say, he was trying to portray a better image than represented the fact, which I agree with. I'm sure that happened.
No, of course.
So then the question is, well, how do you believe in this guy? How does he represent the true church? And I think this goes back to, these labels that you're talking about. When I first learned about polygamy and Joseph Smith's extensive involvement in polygamy, and Fanny Alger and some of this stuff, initially I was shocked. And I thought, oh, how can anybody, how could I rely on anything this guy said? And it disturbed me. It made me uncomfortable. And then my next reaction, which was maybe within 48 hours of the initial discovery, was sort of a sense of relief. And the relief was, oh, now I don't have to believe categorically everything this person said. And that was, and then about 24 hours later, I had another leap of logic, which meant, oh, I don't have to believe everything that's said at General Conference, everything my stake president says. I just don't have to believe that. because they're all highly flawed. And to me, that was a great insight. It freed me, but then it also allowed me to exercise a little more personal judgment in my review and my acceptance of things that I've been taught, things that I'd read, things that Joseph Smith has said. And so I think in a way, these sort of revelations we should view them as freeing, as liberating, because they, he was doing his best. He made a contribution. There's a lot to learn from him. There's also a lot of, just insanity, frankly. I think the whole polygamy saga is just insane. And then one of the reasons I loved your podcast on the ergot, I'm pronouncing it all wrong, but the psilocybin and some of these entheogens, you think, oh, so maybe that's I don't know if that's how it really happened or not, but that's a very interesting theory. And then that's the one of the reasons that your podcast interested me so much is my own spiritual experiences correlate more to this is going to sound highly provocative, but they correspond more to being on some sort of mystical drug-induced high, and they're not drug-induced, but they're all internal. They're in my mind. It's almost hallucinogenic. So that whole theory makes more sense to me than the idea that there's an actual, physical visitation or a physical vision. That makes more sense to me because that corresponds more with my own personal spiritual experiences. And so I guess what I'm saying is, as I learn more about this sort of stuff, in a way, I find it very liberating, and it in some sense it empowers me to start choosing among all the things that we're taught, among all the things that are espoused, to choose the things that are important, that really seem to stand the test of time. And this is where this whole first half and second half of life, I think, is so important. If you know, then you don't need to, you're better able to judge these things the more experience you have.
I want to go back to something you said earlier. You said when you started learning these things, you were shocked by what you were learning. And then, eventually, however long afterwards, you ended up coming with this sense of relief that you could understand a very nuanced Joseph Smith instead of the correlated Joseph Smith that we're talking about here.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of Mormons who learn about Joseph Smith, who learn about his polygamy, his counterfeit money, his possible assassination command of Governor Lilburn Boggs, assassinating a public official, destroying the Nauvoo Expositor printing press, an act of tyranny. People learn about these things and they are shocked. And more often than not, when people are shocked about this, they are leaving. They are leaving the church because they realize that Joseph Smith is not this picture-perfect portrait that they were painted there, that was painted for them their entire lives. And they see Joseph Smith in 3 and 4 dimensions, and they come to understand that he was just a dude, not what he claimed
just
to
a dude,
be.
Yeah. And that's disheartening.
Exactly. Do you think that the church is doing itself a disservice teaching only the correlated Joseph Smith? Because when people have that sticker shock, when they realize that he's just the guy, they just leave. Most people leave when they understand that. Very few people are like yourself or Richard Bushman that can learn these things and study Joseph Smith's history and still believe that he was at some level a prophet.
Yeah, I don't know if that's true, actually. I think a lot of people do know things and they do choose to stay. I grant the point that there is a significant percentage of people who learn facts and true history and they get mad and they leave, for sure. But I think you're presuming, maybe you are, maybe you're not. But I think the idea that everyone sitting in the pews on Sunday is put their head in the sand like an ostrich and is avoiding these things categorically. I don't think that that's true, at least not where I live. I think that most of the people, I think it's unavoidable, as you remain active in the church, that you're going to learn basically all the things there are to learn. And frankly, people maybe not, but I think people who stay, maybe that's going too far. But I do think there are a lot of people who are in church on Sunday who who are aware of things, and know the true histories. So I would push back at least on that point. So then I'm lost now. What was the question we're trying to answer? We're trying to answer from the what was it? What did you ask?
I don't know
initially?
if there is an actual answer to this.
Should the church teach more?
Are they doing themselves a disservice in not teaching the real Joseph Smith?
I think they are. I think the answer to that question is yes, and I think it's completely unsustainable to teach as the canonized, authentic history something that just is not. That's the church has not tackled the subject at all of how do you make sense of someone who, in my last podcast I said this, how do you make sense of someone who by our standards was grotesquely unworthy? Mm-hmm. And he was, by Temple Recommend standards, by our modern standards, he was grotesquely unworthy. So how do you make sense of someone like that who yet is inquiring of God, having spiritual experiences? You can debate all day long whether, he's setting up the true church or whether anything, whether he had the priesthood, some of those sort of things. But I think there's no doubt that he felt he was having spiritual experiences, that he was communicating with, a power beyond this earth. So how does someone like, someone who is so, and he's producing, I don't think it's all profound, but there are elements of, deep meaning, and there's a lot of profound things that he produced in his writings and whatnot. How does someone like, the church has not grappled with the idea of how does someone who is like that, how are they able to have spiritual experiences? How are they able to lead and draw people in, and those sort of deeper questions I think are really interesting. And the church has not even begun to think about those sort of questions.
Jack, this is why I'm enjoying having you on to talk about this, because it's very infrequent that I ever talk to Mormons who really know the history. I go to John Whitmer conference and it's packed full of people who really know who Joseph Smith was. They know a lot about the real history of the church, and they don't harbor these illusions about him being this one divinely inspired man, and, the Book of Mormon being infallible and so on and so forth. They understand that there's a lot of nuance to Joseph Smith, and many of them don't even, come to the conclusion that he was a prophet. They just believe that this is, this church has some good elements, it has some bad elements, and something that you spoke about earlier that you take away, Jack, the community. It offers a community where otherwise people may not have a community. And I think that keeps people coming back to church more often than trying to learn what new revelation Joseph Smith left in his writings that he didn't include in the Doctrine and Covenants.
Well, and that's an interesting observation, because when people get hung up on true church and truth and the way and all this sort of stuff. And if you distill it down,
because it's important, right?
Well, but if you distill down, what is all that supposed to lead us towards? I think it's supposed to lead us towards, community, to loving relationships, to healthy interactions with people.
To a certain extent, though, there's something you said in I think this was in episode 18 that you had on Bill Reel. And you talked about people seeking validation when they point out criticisms about the church. Yeah. They say, hey, look, the church has problems. Now validate that you have these problems. And they're asking the church to validate those things. When we're talking about what is and is not truth, and the church has the final say in what they claim to be truth, people take issue with that when they find out that it's not true. So do you see why people seek validation when they point out problems in the church, whether it's with the history or whether it's the current stances on LGBTQ issues or whatever the case may be? Do you understand that when somebody feels like their trust has been betrayed, or they see something that is counter to what they know as truth, do you think that they are right to call out the organization that's perpetuating those lies?
Well, in my view, there's two issues. One is seeking validation, and the other is should we call out the church? And I think just as a practical matter, if one wants to be happy, and I was trying to say this to Bill, and I'll reiterate it here. if one wants to be happy and independent, it's not the path to seek validation from any group or entity outside of oneself is just not the path to happiness or validation.
I disagree with that.
Okay, then we can have an honest disagreement about that.
Okay,
but I think if one wants peace and if one's relying on some entity, some church, some family group, some club, some school, person, a spouse, to be the source of that's a dead end. That will not lead to the peace or the validation one's looking for, in my view. And I understand that you have a different opinion, and you can hold that opinion. That's fine.
Well, I want to wrap this into what you said earlier, is the community, because the church is obviously made of the community that comprises the congregation, and that's one thing that's great about this church.
Well, let me finish one thought though. And okay. Some people may, you may say, oh, they don't get the validation, and so they should. I think if people want to leave the church, they should leave the church. I mean, I don't think anyone should go to church who doesn't want to go to church. I don't think anyone should go to church who's not happy there, or is uptight, or feels oppressed. You can go to other churches. You can not go to church. You can do whatever you want. And I think for some reason people feel like they can't do that. And they'll say, well, my family will oppress me, or they'll judge me, or I'll be lonely. Or it's like, okay, yeah. That's part of the equation of life that you have to decide. And we all have to decide those sorts of things. You are always making decisions based on very complicated calculus. And a lot of that is not in our hands, and that's just the way it is. But let me, I know I'm droning on here, but before we go on too far, but then you said, should one then call out the church? And I think it's important that one separates one's own sense of worth, validation, the value of one's opinions, how you esteem all that yourself, from then this whether or not we have a duty to then go to the church and then call out the church. And I think some people feel very compelled to do that, to point out things that are inaccurate in the current record or in the current way of teaching. And I think I personally just don't feel compelled to do that. Some people do feel compelled to do that, and I think that's fine. But the point I was trying to make with Bill is, if you're one of those type of people and you're staking your happiness on changing the church, or you're never going to be happy until the church changes, then you will be perpetually unhappy. And it's important, I think, for people's mental health to separate those pursuits, to separate the pursuit of validation and inner peace, and then trying to change an organization that you may or may not ever be able to change.
I think we've seen plenty of evidence that the church changes when there have been enough social pressures to, push them.
I agree with that. That's true. When it comes to outlawing polygamy, when it comes to race and the priesthood, when it comes to a number of things, they have softened their stance, or they have come in direct conflict with what prophets have said before. For sure.
So I guess I want to say that on a personal level, I condone anyone who wants to try and change the church from the inside, because without that, they're only going to have outside pressures pushing on them, and that's only going to reinforce the persecution narrative, whether or not that's accurate. I don't think it is.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I think I agree with that statement. I think that's probably right.
Okay. All right, that was my conversation with Jack, and like I said at the beginning, there were a few things which I wish we could have gone into a bit of a deeper dive with, but I'll just share all of my accumulated thoughts at the end of part 2 of our discussion at the end of next week's episode, and I hope you don't mind hanging in there for it. But also, if you are interested in listening to his podcast or the Mormon Discussion podcast, you can find links to him in the show notes. All right, we had a few new patrons to thank. We have Mike and Glossia. I've never seen that name before. And then we had pledge edits from Betsy and Marissa McCool, also known as Riss, podcast creator, author, so on and so forth. So all of these new patrons, thank you so very much for pledging to support at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. And I hope you enjoy all of the extra content that you get with access to the Patreon special feed. With that being said, we do our NAMO Home Evening monthly hangout. That's on the first Monday of every month, barring extraneous circumstances like there was back in October. So for this month, coming up on November 6th, beginning at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, we have the man, myth, and legend Thomas Smith from Serious Inquiries Only and Thomas in the Bible and Opening Arguments. He will be joining us to talk about a number of things, probably nothing Mormonism whatsoever. But if you are a Patreon, you can check your inbox beginning at about 5:30 Pacific time on Monday night. This is this upcoming Monday, November 6th, 2017. And you will get a link to the Google Hangouts where we are all chatting and discussing. We'll begin at 6 Pacific Standard. That's 9 Eastern. And we're just going to do a Q&A and have a good time talking to Thomas about law, about politics, and a number of other topics. We're probably going to be talking about his some of his more recent episodes in Serious Inquiries Only, where he gave these Trump Participation Awards. They're really, really good episodes. So if you're interested in chatting with Thomas and I, jump onto the Google Hangouts on November 6th, 2017, beginning at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And yeah, we'll call it good from there. I wanted to mention real quick, I was recently on the ImaginaryFriendsShow.com podcast, the one true podcast. That I always enjoy going on Jake Farwharton's show. He always has a panel of like 5 or 6 people, and it's chaos and pandemonium trying to, herd cats, but it's so much fun to be on that show. So I was on the most recent episodes, 425 of, it's called The Way of the Dodo is the episode title. So you'll find a link to that in the show notes. And also I was recently on the Wayward Willis podcast. So John and Logan, we had a pretty fun chat about a number of things surrounding Mormonism. Logan has absolutely no concept of Mormonism. However, his dad, John, has a fair amount of exposure to it and knows a bit of the history. So we were able to chat quite a bit, and Logan was just kind of in the background like, what the hell are you guys talking about? No, it was really fun. So you can check the show notes for a link to the Wayward Willis podcast as well, where you can listen to John, Logan, and I talk Mormonism and the Smith entheogen theory. So that's always fun. All right, with that, I think we are all set for today. I want to begin the end with saying thank you so much to our social media guru, that is Julie. She takes care of us on the Facebook and Twitter pages. Thank you so much, Julie. Also want to thank Jason Camo. He created the music that you're listening to in your ears right now. Go to aloststateofmind.com to hear more of his music and download it from there. Thank you so much to Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres. He provides the legal counsel for Ground Gnome Studios, LLC, and I really appreciate you, Andrew. Thank you. If you want to get in touch with me, you can find me at the contact page on nakedmormonismpodcast.com or just nakedmormonism@gmail.com or Twitter and Facebook. I always love interacting with people there. Be sure to check out my other half podcast, the My Book of Mormon podcast with Marie Kent. I haven't plugged that in quite a while, and Marie and I are having a really good time over there. We just did Zion's Camp. Well, we just recorded it. I'm not sure when it's going up, but, check that out. But most importantly, I want to thank all of you inspiringly audacious listeners once again for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. Quote, on another occasion, having been discharged from arrest through informality in the writ requiring his apprehension for high treason against the state of Missouri, Smith gave a party at Monmouth, and, after a regular frolic with his lawyers and friends, became thoroughly intoxicated. On being asked how it was that he, a prophet of the Lord, could get drunk, he replied that it was necessary that he should do so in order to prevent his followers from worshiping him as a god. End quote. Suppose that's one of those stories that Mormons say Joseph Smith was just a man, May have been a prophet, but he was also a man. Had to deal with the same temptations that we did. But he was doing it for noble causes. He didn't want people to worship him. Yeah, of course. The preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2017, all rights reserved.